Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we are going to take a look at our GetInfoWithValidation that we finished in another earlier video. At the end of that video, we were focusing in on some of the troubleshooting related to the user wanting to exit our application early. In other words, they entered in the first name, the last name, the email address, perhaps correctly, but then they got to the age and they didn't want to continue. And we saw that there were not any great ways for the user to enter in, or rather to exit out of our application. And so to understand this, let's run this one more time. We'll go ahead and put in my first name, we'll put in my last name, and we will go ahead and put in my email address. But then let's say I didn't want to put in my age, and so I put in -1. I'm going to be prompted again, put in 130. And we saw then that we could technically exit out of the application by either hitting Control-C or putting in some unexpected information. In other words, something that the scanner would ultimately throw an exception. Now, if possible, what we'd like to do is we'd like to rewrite this function in a way such that it does not, in fact, cause an exception to be thrown. In other words, we'd like for our application to always exit gracefully. And so to accomplish this, what we want to do is we want to go back to our GetInfoWithValidation, and we will change up a little bit how we are collecting the information. So in other words, instead of using a do-while loop, we're actually going to convert these over to while loops. Now, I wanted to do it this way first so that you could see sort of a simplified way of continually prompting the user for information. But if we, as we saw in this video and also in the earlier videos, it doesn't provide the user with a great experience. In other words, we want them to be able to successfully exit out of our application by entering in some safe word. For instance, for the first name and the last name or the email address, perhaps entering in the word exit or quit to be able to leave our application as opposed to simply crashing it. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and comment out all of our do-while loops. Now, we're not changing any of the rules, so all of the rules from the earlier videos still apply, meaning how we want to validate the data. But what we are going to do is we're going to add now a java.lang.boolean here, and we're going to call it continue, and we're going to set it optimistically to true. And the idea is that we want to continue collecting information until the user either gets done completely with entering in the information or they want to exit out early. And so what we'll do, we'll leverage the same scanner and we'll leverage the same prompts, but what we're going to do is we're now going to put them inside of while loops. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here, I'm going to start this whole process over, and I'm going to check first to see, well, continue equal to true. And the idea is that inside of this loop, if the user enters in one of those prompts, one of those special prompts, then we should change the flag to continue to false so that we exit out of not only the first loop, but ultimately all of the latter loops. And this will then allow for us to both validate the data as well as allow the user to exit early. And to accomplish this, then what we want to do is we want to have while continue equal to true, and we want to look then at the initial validation that we did in the earlier videos, and that is the first name length equal to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to leverage those default values that we assigned. And in the case of the first name, we made it an empty string so that the length was equal to 0. Now, in this case, what we can do then is we can actually borrow the same prompts that we saw earlier. As a matter of fact, my system.out.println doesn't change, and my first name assignment via the scanner.next does not change. But what we do add is we add an if statement inside of the while loop that checks to see if the first name, and then we'll use our equals ignore case method. And we'll stick with the word exit because we're going to assume that nobody is going to have the first name of exit. And if that is equal to true, then we simply set our continue equal to false. Now, if you look at this for just a second, you'll notice that basically what I have is I have a knotting relationship between the return of our equals ignore case and our continue. And so you can leave this code the way it is if you're comfortable with it, or what you can do is you can do a further simplification by simply saying continue will be equal to the not of our first name equals ignore case and exit. And I'm going to explicitly put in the true here. I'm going to clean this up a little bit because I don't like having I'd like to have this tabbed over here. So give me 1 second. Let me clean this up just a little bit. There we go. And then what I'll do is I'll sneak this in here this way. Again, if you're comfortable with that first approach and you don't like the second approach, I also am not a big fan of these shorthand notations, but in this particular case, if you think about it, then if this condition is true, in other words, that the word exit is in the first name, then you would not that. So not true is going to be false and continue would be false. Also, if it is not in the first name, so in other words, that this returns false, the whole expression returns false, and then continue is equal to true. So in this case, it handles exactly what we need for it to do in that one line. Now, what we can do is we can do the exact same thing, the same compound condition, again, with continue equal to true. And then we can also check to see if our last name dot length is equal to 0. And if those two things are in fact true, then what we can do is we can come up here and borrow the same code that we had in our do while loop. The system.out.println, as well as the collection of the last name using the scanner.next. And again, what we can do is we can leverage now this continue not of our last name dot equals ignore case of our safe word exit equal to true. Now, before we go any further, let's think about this for just a second. Let's say that the user typed in exit while we were prompting them for the first name, in which case it flipped our continue flag. And that means that this while loop will, in fact, never run. And that's actually what we want to have happen. We don't want to continue to prompt the user with the additional requests if they've already acknowledged that they wish to exit our application. Now, again, it depends on the behavior that you want for your application. This just gives us another way of doing this. So let's go ahead and do this now with the remaining fields. And we'll start off with our continue equal to true. And then what we'll do is we'll check a couple of conditions related to our Blazor ID. And if we recall earlier, we said that the Blazor ID has to include the @uab.edu. So we know that it has to be an absolute minimum of 9 characters long or greater than 8, as well as making sure that we do wish to continue. And so what we can do now is we can check a couple of things. We can do first our Blazor ID.length. And so this is where we're going to need to think a little bit about our conditions. So while the Blazor ID.length is less than or equal to 8, and now what we have is an OR. And so the idea here is that both of these conditions need to be false. In other words, if either of these conditions are true, then we need to reprompt the user. And by that second condition, I'm referring to checking to see if the Blazor ID dot contains at uab.edu. And now what we want to do is we want to think for just a second. Are we looking to see that it contains it or that it does not contain it? And so in this case, we're looking to see that if it does not contain it, so either this condition being true or this condition being true, anding with the continue equal to true, will get us what we want with respect to our loop. And the idea here is then once again, we can borrow some of the code from earlier, particularly our system.out.println that allows for us to enter, prompt the user to enter a valid email address, followed by the scanner.next. And again, that same little trick here where we simply leverage our continue. And what we want to do is we want to see whether or not the user put in our special escape word. And again, we're going to keep the same one here. That is going to be our exit. You can use exit, you can use quit, whatever you ultimately will prompt the user with. And we'll go back and adjust the prompts in just a second. At this point, then, if we have managed to make it through that third loop with the continue being true and having successfully met our conditions, then it's on to our integer values. And so we again set up a loop starting with our continue. So our continue equal to true. And now what we want to do is we want to look to guidance for the age. And so if we recall, we had two conditions with the age, that it was less than or equal to 0 or greater than or equal to 123. And so we actually want to check both of these. So again, what we do is we put these inside of a nested set of parentheses where we check to see if either of these are true, hence the or, combined with an and for the continue equal to true, in which case then we simply want to repeatedly prompt the user. Now, the catch in this particular case is twofold. Number one, we saw in the example at the start of this video that if I put in an alphanumeric response, or for that matter, just characters, alphabetic characters, then I ended up throwing an exception. And the idea is that we don't necessarily want the application to crash if the user puts in something like that. So instead, what we want to do is we want to wrap any attempt with our scanner.next line in a try catch. And so what we'll have here is a catch, an exception EX. And at this point, what this will do is this will gracefully catch any attempt at the scanner to unsuccessfully capture an integer. In other words, if the user puts in a alphabetic character instead of number, it'll throw the exception, but we will catch it. And what we will do is we will simply display it. So a system.out.println ex.toString. And at this point, then what we probably want to consider doing is providing the user with a little bit of extra guidance here. System.out.println. And maybe a warning or a note, please enter a valid integer. And then what we can do is inside of our try block is where we would want to do any additional validation. In other words, to check to see if the user entered in a magic value. And so let's think about what that magic value would look like. Well, if they put in an age of -1, essentially just means that they did not, in fact, wish to provide their age. And so what we can do is, once we've successfully captured it, we can check to see if our age is equal to -1. And then if it is, our continue is equal to false, because basically at this point, the user did not want to continue. Now, what we can do again is, if you're comfortable with it, we can simplify this code a little bit and combine it into one line and simply check to see whether or not the age is equal to -1. And if that returns true, then we simply not it again. And again, if the age is not equal to -1, in other words, it's equal to a valid age, perhaps 50, then that is going to be false, and not false is going to be equal to true, in which case then continue is equal to true. Now, keep in mind, this does not provide us any problems, because we would never have actually made it to this prompt in the event that the continue had been changed earlier in our function. In other words, if they got tired of using this while we were checking the email address and we flagged the exit through the continue, then we would have never been prompting them for their age to begin with. We will employ a similar trick now with our height. Again, what we're going to do is we're going to check to see that our continue is equal to true. And again, we have this combined then statement for our or that handles our height being less than or equal to 0 or greater than 108. And if either of those conditions are true, then the or will result in a true combined with continue, anding the continue, in which case we simply borrow then our prompts from our do while loops, where we prompt the user for the height, followed by an attempt to scan it using the next double, which, for the same reasons as with the integers, we need to put inside of a try-catch block, capturing whatever exception is thrown in the event that the user puts in something that the scanner cannot handle. And then, as before, we can simply print out the exception toString so that the user gets some additional information, as well as a nice friendly message to the user, in this case specifying that they have to provide a valid double. And again, we can make these messages a little bit clearer, a little more friendly, and so on. Now, we want to think about what is our safe value for our height. And there's probably no better value than -1, just like before. And so we can play the same trick, where we just simply check to see if continue is then the nodding of the height equal to -1. And so we need the double equal sign there. And again, if you're comfortable with the if statement, that's perfectly fine. If you're not comfortable with combining it, don't feel like you need to. But the idea is that this if statement is basically just doing nothing more than nodding whatever the return is from the equality of earlier in age equal to -1 and then height equal to -1. Now, at this point, we've basically got a secret from the user, if you would. In other words, they don't know what these special values are. So we probably want to go back and modify our prompts just a little bit. So please enter a valid first name or exit, in which case it just tells the user what to do in the case that they are done with your application. And we do that for the first name, last name, and the Blazor ID. However, we cannot do this for our integer and for a double. in which case we want to put a different value in, or -1, or again, -1.0. All right, at this point, let's go ahead and build it. So far, so good. We have just one last thing that we have to handle. We've now got the prompts to the user. We've got the ability to continue or leave early. And so what we want to do now is we want to handle our results return value to main. Now, if you think about it, the original intention of the continue flag was to be very explicit in that we wanted to continue collecting information from the user. And if anything, earlier in the earlier videos, we had used our results to return back whether or not the results were in fact valid. But in this particular case, we've got two flags that we can leverage. And so what we want to think a little bit about is the role of the continue. In fact, the continue actually plays a couple of different roles, because the only way for the user to get through this particular function is if they have successfully put in all pieces of information. In other words, that all fields were validated, or they typed in exit or one of the other special values, in which case the continue actually serves as our validation variable, as well as controlling the flow of our while loops. And what that means is that, unlike in the earlier examples where we could return our results, which we of course could, we can also return our continue, because basically it means that if we manage to make it the whole way through this function with continue equal to true, that means that the user didn't give up on us, and that we have successfully entered in all of the information no matter how many prompts it took to the user. And so let's go ahead and build this. Let's come over to our command window, and since we've already got this wired up correctly, we should be able to just rerun it. And you'll see that we have our updated prompt. Let's go through this correctly first. So we'll put in Gregory, last name Myers, gmyers@uab.edu. We'll put in an age and then a height. And sure enough, it looks like our validation works. But now let's try to break this. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to put in exit for my first name. And sure enough, I get kicked out of my function and results are equal to false. Let's go further into it. Let's put in Gregory, and then let's type in exit for my last name. And sure enough, I'm exiting out early, which looks promising. I'm going to go through and I'm going to check my third field, my email address. And sure enough, if I put in exit, I get to get out of it early, as well as having my results false. And now for the big challenge, I'm going to move on past the email address, and I'm going to check for the valid age. And again, if we put in a number that was too large, we got reprompted again. But if I put in -1, which is our special value, I get booted out of the function. One last field to check: my first name, my last name, my email address. I'll put in a valid age this time, and I'm going to go ahead and put in some nonsense value first, and I get prompted again. But if I put in the -1, I get booted out of the function appropriately, and my results again are equal to false. And so again, it looks like all of our validation works. And as one final test, I'm going to go ahead and put in valid information for the first 3 fields. And then I'm going to try to break this by putting in the letter A. And we seem to have an infinite loop. So let's see if we can go back and fix this real quick. Should be reprompting. 1 second here. Let's see if we can set up the debugger if need be. All right, so let's go ahead and make one little change real quick. We want to go ahead and flush the buffer here once we've caught the exception. And so to do that, what we'll do here is we'll actually go ahead and do a scanner.next, which will simply just attempt then to read whatever was on the input. And we'll do that in the exception branches. In other words, basically, once we've thrown the exception, then we throw away that particular piece of information. And then let's go ahead and build this one more time. Let's come out here and let's run it. We're going to go ahead and check this. And then we put in the letter A, and other than perhaps needing to clean up our prints a little bit, you'll notice here I have a print instead of a print line. It throws the error. It tells us the type of error. We can add to that if we would like. And then we have their message there. It says, please enter a valid integer, and then it reprompts us for our range of values. Now we're going to go ahead and gracefully exit out of this. I'm going to make one more change real quick. Make sure and clean up my presentation a little bit. And then just a little note here that this essentially flushes our scanner of the offending value. And the same thing is true then here. Now, the other thing to note here before we leave this is that you probably in your perusal of the Java doc may have noticed that there's actually another function that we could have used. If you take a look real quick at the scanner dot has next, we could actually have wrapped that into it. They have a scanner dot has next int as well as a scanner dot has next double. Both of those would have allowed for us to return a Boolean and basically avoid the problem of capturing the exception. Again, both approaches are perfectly fine. This gives you some exposure to parsing issues from the command line, though, and the need then to flush the buffer. This point, then we'll go ahead and build it one more time. We'll come out here to the command line. We'll type in my first name, my last name, my email address, and then I'm going to put a valid age in, but then I'm going to put in some nonsense for the height. And you can see here that I am throwing the exception. I'm indicating that I've thrown an exception, but I've captured it, so I've not crashed the application. I've provided a friendly message back to the user, as well as reprompting them again to enter in a valid height. And at this point, then I'm just going to type in -1, and you can see here that my validation has in fact failed because I exited my loop early. Hopefully you found this particular video useful. This has taken a deeper dive into how you can validate fields and still control the flow of the user interaction. Again, we'll take a look at this many times through these series of videos. Take a look at regular expressions later on. This should hopefully give you then a start with how you would handle an interactive application and then gracefully exit in the event that the user doesn't want to use your application anymore. As always, hopefully you found this video useful. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.